And good Monday afternoon. It is 1 p.m. here, and Frank Prosnitz joins me. Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing okay. And tell us a little bit about the discussion we're going to be having today.
Well, of course, today is Martin Luther King Day and Martin Luther King Jr. Day. His birthday was actually Friday. We celebrated on Monday. So for a lot of people, they go off and they have a long weekend and don't think about the meaning of the day. It's just really important that we do. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered on April 4, 1968, and we remember him for what he did, and he was an individual who really took a really peaceful, believed in peace. So as I think of him and remember him, it's about peace, equality, opportunity, dignity, and hope. We've asked Keith Stokes. Keith, who is very well known in Newport, former council person in Newport. He was on the executive director of the Newport Chamber of Commerce. He was executive director of the now it's the Commerce Commission Economic Development Corporation. He's also a vice president of the 1696 Heritage Group and is pretty much an expert on African American and Jewish history. And so we thought there was nobody who was better to help us understand and learn a little bit more about Martin Luther King Jr. Education is the best way for us to understand. And so we're excited about having Keith with us today.
Yes, and as we bring Keith up, I will tell you that I just watched the virtual celebration that 6 organizations did today at noon. And it was, if anybody's watching from that, given the circumstances, it was a great ceremony that took about 45 minutes, just about an hour ago. So great ceremony. Kudos to everybody who participated today. And good afternoon, Keith.
Hey, good afternoon, Ryan, Frank. Great to see you again.
Well, good to see you. And thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe I'll start off with the really simple question, and that what does this day and this commemoration mean to you?
Well, again, Martin Luther King and his legacy is something that, for myself and many others that I know, that we celebrate each and every day. It very much represents the legacy of social justice and equal rights and civil rights, which is an ongoing business, and certainly today in 2021 is as important as it's ever been.
Yeah, I would think so with what's happened recently. But let me go back a little bit. Tell us a little bit about the man. I mean, we know about his speeches. Most people know about his speeches. I'm not sure that that a kid who's in 11th grade right now knows a whole lot about Martin Luther King, other than what he may or may not read in the books, and knows that, in most years, knows it's a day off of school.
Well, I think the most important aspect of Martin Luther King's legacy is the history and the shoulders that he stood on. Martin Luther King today is recognized as one of the great civil rights leaders of America and the world, but he's also recognized as a man of the cloth. And that legacy of being a social justice leader and even a political advocate, and also being a minister, is something that dates back to the very origins of the Black church in America. What made Martin Luther King was the Black church. And in fact, it starts by the time of the American Revolution, where people of color, people of African heritage, largely those that were enslaved, the few that were free, didn't have a right to organize or assemble. It was unlawful, even here in New England. So for the most part, the only time that people of African heritage could assemble is during worship services. And by the end of the American Revolution, you begin to see a large enough free African communities in Philadelphia, Boston, here in Rhode Island, at Newport and Providence, and they start to form some of the earliest free Black churches in America. Each and every one of these Black churches, in Providence, it's Coggan Street Baptist Church. In Newport, it's the Union Congregational Colored Church. In Philadelphia, it's the Mother Bethel AME Church and the Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. Those all founding Black churches had some very interesting commonalities. All of their initial ministers were actively engaged in social justice and political rights. Each and every one of them were engaged in helping to organize Prince Hall Masonic organizations, free African schools, early African civic organizations, and they got actively involved and engaged in political rights at that time. So what's important to recognize is that the legacy of civil rights in America, and really the legacy and the molding of a Martin Luther King, come directly from the early origins of the Black church. And we see that to this very day. In fact, the man that was elected as historically the United States Senator in Georgia has his roots in the Black church. So you really can't disconnect the two.
That Martin Luther King came from.
Absolutely. So you cannot disconnect the two. So when you talk about Martin Luther King, when you talk about social justice and civil rights, you have to talk about the history of the Black community and our history which began within our churches.
Martin Luther King had a great deal of hope in all of his speeches, but not also, I don't think, Pollyannish. I think he truly understood and articulated the needs. How have we done? How have we done to honor his legacy? Have we made progress?
Well, first of all, it's important to recognize the man and the time that he lived. I think it's very interesting that people today freely quote Martin Luther King for whatever political or public or social justice position they might have. But the reality is that Martin Luther King was a creation of a fight for justice for the African American community in the 40s, 50s, into the 60s. He was fighting for equal justice, civil rights for Black people in America. In fact, if you go back and look at some of the polls at that time, in fact, one very telling poll, the year he was assassinated, 75% of white Americans disapproved of him. So it's important to recognize is that what Martin Luther King embodied was to shake the tree of America to realize that fellow Americans, simply because of their race, were being unjustly treated. Come forward today in 2021, here we see in our nation's capital, one of our most sacred governmental places, we see a sea of people carrying Confederate flags, installing lynching and noosing stations, wearing sweatshirts that talk about the Holocaust in jest, possibly. This is 2021. If Martin Luther King came back today and saw that event, I think his sense would be is, what has changed?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly was horrific a week or so ago. But I guess my perception is much of that grows out of fear. America is changing. The norms are being challenged, and there's no way of turning it back because they will continue to be challenged, and the whiteness of America is going away.
It's not a matter of Blackness or whiteness. It's a matter of demographic evolution. The men and women who chose to be insurrectionists and riot at the nation's capital, I equate them to a T-Rex with one foot in the tar pit. The reality is that if you look at the demographic trends going on in this country, and in fact, it is reported by the federal census, the projections are that by 2045 to 2050, the majority of this people of this country will be brown and Black. That is the demographic certainty. So for many of the people who are marching on the Capitol, my sense is they weren't marching on because Biden's become president and Trump will not be president. They were marching on because the night before, a Black man and a Jewish man in the Democratic Party had won Georgia. And they're seeing each and every day in commercials, in their elected officials, in their public spokespersons, are now looking based upon the diversity that America is finally coming to conclusion with. So like that T-Rex in the tar pit, they're very dangerous, but they are de-evolving. And at some point in the near future, it goes away. So the future of America has to reflect on the majority of its people. And the majority of the people today are as diverse and as racially dynamic as America as always should have been.
Keith, I was just wondering, every time we talk, I always say, oh, we should have asked them about this. Can you just give us a little bit of background about the 1696 Heritage Group and what you're doing, what you're trying to do, and if there's anybody out there that could use your resources? I think it's important that we talk about how maybe people can get involved or how 1696 Heritage Group can help organizations, businesses, things like that.
We're a consulting group, and we consult with government authorities, businesses, historical institutions throughout the African diaspora. And we provide research assistance, interpretation assistance. We're doing a lot of program planning, lectures and series and such. As an example, we've worked with the Historical Society of Africa, and I was in Ghana back in 2019 and working with them in developing their programs along the African diaspora. I've had the chance to work with Heritage Trusts and historical institutions in Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, Curacao, again, all tying in the important research and interpretation of the African diaspora. Here in Rhode Island, we're working very closely with a team of scholars with the city of Providence, as Mayor Lawser is designing and developing his truth, reconciliation, and reparations policy plans. So we're very excited to work with a whole diverse assortment of businesses and government organizations and individuals who just have an interest in uncovering and interpreting their early history, be it African-American history, ethnic history, which has largely been hidden and unknown to this day.
You know, I'm going to jump over where I wanted to go, but come back to it. Talk about the educational program that you're developing, the curriculum for the schools.
Well, there's been a team of scholars and organizations working over the last several years that are beginning the process of designing a curriculum that could be made available to K-12 public schools in Rhode Island. We're very excited about this endeavor. One of the aspects over the last several years that we've been able to do is through the Rhode Island Historical Society is work with the Rhode Island Department of Education and create a resource guide, which is a part of their website that provides access to primary, secondary documentation and other interpretations on the very deep, rich history of African-American people in Rhode Island. One of the most important aspects of doing this work is that it's the interpretation and research work. Right now, I have a database of every slave ship that was documented that originated in Rhode Island. Obviously documented, there could have been more, but at this point, I have 934 documented voyages. What town it originated from, who the owners were of the vessel, its destination, the number of slaves transported via the Middle Passage and eventually back to Rhode Island. What's fascinating about that database is that the 934 documented voyages, over 600 come from Newport. And when you start to break down who's participating in it, it represents every race, every ethnicity, every religion. And it's important to recognize that the transatlantic slave trade was an equal opportunity employer, and all people participated at some point. But stepping back from that is that, and I'll be very candid, slavery is not Black history. Black history is how our African heritage ancestors survived and thrived despite enslavement. And I think there's a problem at times when certain individuals or institutions focus exclusively on interpreting the slave trade or slavery. And what happens is that we know more about certain slave traders in Rhode Island. We know more about John Brown and James DeWolf than we do of people like Auber Tanner and Nukama Mariku and Salba Nubia and Bristol Yama and John Camino, and I can go on and on. So it's been fascinating to me that we've kind of turned on its head Black history, and we're still focusing on the slave traders, the slave systems, and not focusing on the primary and secondary documented evidence that we have in the state of African heritage people and how they survived and thrived despite enslavement. And again, that's one aspect of the story. We'll be designing for the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society later this year an online virtual exhibit on the history of Black entrepreneurism in Newport, dating from the colonial times and accelerating through the Gilded Age into the early 20th century. It will include biographies. It will include a site map of many historic structures that exist today in Newport, but at one point were occupied and operated by Black businesses. A large number of those businesses on Bellevue Avenue, what today we call the Historic Hill. So there is significant amounts of primary, secondary data out there and documentation to begin to unveil the story of African heritage people in Newport, in Rhode Island, in America, but it's been largely untouched because I think people are limiting themselves in looking at certain aspects of our history.
Are local governments and maybe even the state, but more so local governments, are they willing to put up? I'm not, I hate calling them monuments or whatever, but different items that might remember the African American contribution to their communities. I don't know if that question makes sense, but
no, again, the city of Providence under Mayor Laws and his staff have been very assertive in designing and developing a comprehensive process. So rather than jumping into taking monuments down, putting monuments up, developing curriculum or programming, they're developing a very comprehensive deliberative process that starts with research, interpretation, and truth-telling, and that will lead to reconciliation, and that process will lead towards public engagements, programming, education, tours, and then eventually to some type of policy or set of policies of reparations. That's the most comprehensive program that I've seen in the state, and one of the most comprehensive in the nation. Newport, I don't have a sense of. I don't have a sense of what the city council is doing or wants to do. I couldn't address that for you.
You mentioned reparations. In what form do they take? And I know that I'm sure there are a lot of white people out there who are fearful of that of that word, and that they're thinking that that's going to cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, and more.
Well, reparations have existed by governments, by business institutions, and education institutions for a very long time. The issue of reparations for the issues of African indigenous people slavery, that is going to require significant documentation and validation of the history, which is currently going on. The next step is presenting that information so that the public can have a firm understanding of exactly what went on, and most importantly, how it impacted negatively and how it provided a negative impact to those dedicated people of color. And then eventually you come up with a series of policies and programs. Is it individual payouts or 40 acres and a meal? Possibly not. But it certainly could be reinvestment or target investments in programs and policies and initiatives to provide an equal playing field for all Rhode Islanders or all Newporters or all Americans. I mean, to give you some very just simple examples, Evanston, Illinois, a year ago decided in their reparations policy that they would dedicate a portion of their marijuana tax dollars and dedicate it to areas of affordable housing and small business, minority business investment. In the case of Georgetown University, who had identified that as a part of their early founding, that several of the investments in that university came from the sale of slaves, and those proceeds went to building that university. The student body came together and voted on a non-binding referendum that each of the students would add an additional fee to their student costs. That money would be set aside for scholarships and investments. So again, there are a number of creative ways that we can provide and advance social justice and equality. And all we need to do is start with the facts, understand the facts, and then come up with a plan to engage and allow everyone to benefit from that. In the case of Rhode Island, I can tell you, because I'm deeply involved in that research, we're talking about 4 centuries of documentation. It's significant. And I'll also say very candidly, and again, for those that focus on the slave trade and slavery, I can assure you that any type of future reparations policy will have less to do with John Brown being a slave trader, but probably a lot to do with Brown University and the gentrification that they and others were involved in mid-20th century College Hill, Lippet Hill, and Fox Point neighborhoods of Providence.
What do you see politically happening? I mean, one of the things, I don't want to get deeply into politics, but one of the things that was clear during this past election and some of the efforts that go on nationwide is to really suppress the vote and to suppress the vote of minorities. That's got to be high on the agenda for, if not the Biden administration, certainly a lot within the African American community and within the Democratic Party to try and make those changes so that the process is more open.
Well, voter suppression that's been directed to people of color has been a tactic used since the end of the American Civil War. And what's fascinating is that if you research and read and understand the Reconstruction era, those years following the Civil War, it's fascinating to see the tactics used, both organized and unorganized, to suppress Black voters in the South, and then organized through the advent of the Ku Klux Klan and then certain political institutions, and how much similarities to that you see today. I mean, again, what struck me a week and a half ago in watching that insurrection and riot at the U.S. Capitol were the number of Confederate flags that were waving. People were waving the Confederate flag, a flag that represents tyranny, treason, insurrection, side by side with our American federal flag.
Well, they took the American flag and they used it as a weapon.
To see that, because those individuals in 2021, clearly understanding the repercussions of having a Confederate flag, felt bold enough and proud enough to carry that flag as they raided our United States Capitol building.
They were emboldened by a leader who in fact continues to want to celebrate the generals of the South.
I think the easiest thing in the world for us to do is to blame any one person. It goes back to Rhode Island and the slave trade. We spend so much time blaming one or two slave traders when it was an entire complicit system. And it's the same in 2021. It's not one president or one senator or one bigot. There were tens and tens of thousands of people marching on that US Capitol, hundreds of people carrying Confederate flags. It is more than any one man. This is a belief system that still exists within America. And it makes me fearful and concerned.
What happens next?
I think the next thing, which is important, is that we should allow, by the virtue of our Constitution, to the duly elected government to sit, allow them with Congress to design and develop policies to put forth before the American people so we can decide if these policies are what we need and what will help move us forward. If we believe that they are not, then unelect them through a democratic process. So I think and I hope that there's going to be time for calm. There'll be time for deliberate decision making. But what's most important is that if there was ever a time for us to go back and look at history, understand how we got to where we are and how we can move forward, it's today. Because everything that we're seeing today is almost a complete mirror image of post-Civil War Reconstruction America. And unfortunately, those who were at the greatest risk at that time were newly freed enslaved African-American people. And today, the people who are at greatest risk today in America are African-American people. And again, that's only validated by the number of assaults and murders and arrests that you've seen and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement over the last several years. It's all been validated.
Yeah, in case people are confused, it's I think a young black man is 7 times more likely to be killed by police than a white man, and I think that's the figures. I may be wrong, but pretty close to it.
But the bottom line is that what's the difference today than Reconstruction era?
Yeah. Who are the leaders? Who are the people who will lead us?
Well, again, if anyone appoints himself as a leader, I think you need to be very careful with that person. But I think ultimately it's not a leader, it's leadership. And leadership comes from consensus building from a majority of people. And that comes through political systems, government systems, community systems. So as an example, in the case of Newport, if Newport truly wants to be a better engaged community, then it should reach out across the city and engage people of all walks of life to participate in that process. And our elected officials should represent that diversity of representation, and they should reach out to that. The same at the state capitol. I mean, one of the things that I've said consistently is that it's ironic that Rhode Island has some of the deepest and richest African-American history, but doesn't have an African-American history curriculum. I wrote an op-ed piece yesterday for the Providence Journal on the life of Representative Mahlon Van Horn, the state's first Black state representative in 1885, a Newporter. Very few people know about him. They don't know about him here in Newport. There's no recognition of him in the State House. And it just fascinates me to the fact that a man that was so well written, had contributed so much for so many over a long period of time, is largely unknown within this state. So when I hear people saying that we need more Black history, we need to quote Martin Luther King, the response I have to him is that what exactly are you doing tangibly to make that happen? Beyond providing a quote or posting a quote on Facebook and social media, what are you doing to advance real change? And that means building curriculums, creating employment opportunities, making a real, tangible, physical difference.
Keith, maybe talk a little bit about Reverend Van Horn. He was a long lost relative, not lost, but a related to you.
No, he's my direct ancestor. In fact, if you look behind me, that is his statue of Othello from 1887. My kids appropriately put a mask on it. But we own a large number of his heirlooms from both his church and his home on John Street, 47 John Street. But Mahlon Van Horn was, again, very much like Martin Luther King, a part of a number of post-Civil War Black ministers across the country who were equally involved in political rights, social justice, and religious concernments. He was a 30-year pastor of the Union Colored Congregational Church in Newport. That church was a direct evolution of the Free African Union Society. The church building still stands on Division Street with a significant amount of history. But what's most important is Van Horn was one of many Black men and women, Newport, Providence, New Haven, Boston, Philadelphia, who were interacting on almost a daily basis in the late 19th century, advancing Black rights, Black civil rights, social justice, access to education. And we have all this documentation in place. And again, very few people know this. Very few people recognize this. And what hurts me is in Rhode Island, if you say Black history, people will raise the name of James DeWolf, a slave trader from Bristol, than they would of Reverend Mahlon Van Horn, or the many other Black men and women who were champions of justice in the 18th and 19th century.
What would you hope that the city of Newport does to perhaps bring more enlightenment to the history of African Americans in the city of Newport?
I just really couldn't speak to that because I don't have a sense what the city leadership interests might be in that area. So it's hard for me to say. I mean, I'm certainly working with Providence and working with many other communities, but not in my hometown. So it's hard for me to have a sense of what their priorities are and what their interests might be.
Do you have a sense that anybody's working on it in Newport?
No, I do not. No.
So I would guess, my words, not yours, that you would hope that I would hope that the Newport City Council at least takes an interest, particularly with the involvement that Newport had in the slave trade. Why was Newport and Rhode Island so involved?
Well, again, Frank, it's the starting point's not the slave trade. It's, in fact, one of the things that I'm doing with the city of Providence as a part of their reparations process is because the city is very much focused on the history of indigenous people and the history of African people. The start of this research and how we will present it will begin not with the slave trade. It will begin with the colony of Rhode Island well before European colonization. What was New England like for the Algonquin people from Maine to Massachusetts into Rhode Island well before European colonization? And it's the same with the African people. We will not start with the first slave arriving in Newport or Rhode Island. We will start with the African continent and some of the great West African kingdoms of Mali and certainly Ghana and Ashanti. Because what's important to understand is that when those Africans arrived, they didn't arrive simply as blank slates. They were forced immigrants. They brought with them their culture, their language, their religion, and their labor. And it's the same with our native people. To this day, you can walk through the city of Providence across Rhode Island, and every few feet you'll run into an indigenous name, be it a river or a place. But very few people have little or no understanding of those origins and the meanings within that. So one of the things that I think is an important starting point is not slave trade. It's not the King Philip's War and the near genocide of the Narragansett and the indigenous people. The starting point is the very lives and history of those people.
Keith, maybe we can give some folks another starting point. You mentioned your hometown of Newport, and you and your family, your wife, are very involved in tours as well as other programs in the city. What are some of the things that people can get involved in, or do you have some recommendations of some places to go or some tours or programs that people can check out?
And let me dovetail that and ask about resources as well, that people want to go and do some of their own research.
I think the Newport Historical Society is one of the finest historical institutions in the country. And Ruth Taylor and her team there have access to documents and artifacts and a repository it's second to none. And they're running tours, they're running educational programs, which are validated and documented, and they do a great job. Again, the city has done a great job with the Common Burying Ground Commission in restoring all of our historic burying grounds. We've worked very closely with them with the Gods of Laker portion and section of the Common Burying Ground in Newport. But I think what's most important is that there's a significant amount of hidden history that exists in this city that can take us well beyond slavery and well beyond the 18th century. As I said earlier, Newport has one of the largest existing structures of African-related historic structures that are largely along Historic Hill, Bellevue Avenue, Memorial Boulevard, all within those neighborhoods, even in the Point neighborhood. In fact, I worked with the Rhode Island Historical Society several years ago and a National Park Service grant to do a site survey of historic structures in Rhode Island that are related to civil rights. And we identified over 100 existing historic structures directly related to civil rights in Rhode Island, nearly 40 in Newport alone. And each and every one of these sites could easily qualify for National Historic Register designation. And we'll go through that process. What's been fascinating to me in that process is that very few people in Newport would have any idea that these structures, homes, places of worship, businesses, have this kind of connection. And to give you one very good example is the Martin Luther King Center on Marcus Wheaton Boulevard. Very few people even know who Marcus Wheaton is. Very few people even know the fact that the original building that constructed the Martin Luther King Center did not begin as a King Center, did not begin as a community center or a rec center. It was completed in 1943 as a segregated colored USO building during World War II. Because if you happened to be Black or Hispanic and of color, and you were serving your country during World War II, you did not have the right to go to the Navy YMCA down in Washington Square and enjoy all the services there. It was segregated. So eventually, to provide some assistance to Black and brown sailors and armed service men and women, the colored USO was constructed on West Broadway. That building later evolved into the rec, later evolved into what is today the Martin Luther King Center. That building has a significant history and social history to the evolution of Newport, not Selma, Alabama, but Newport as a place of segregation in the 1940s during World War II. So there are dozens and dozens of buildings and structures that have untold histories that now have been documented and are available for interpretation and learning within Newport that take you far beyond issues of slavery and slave trading.
And Keith, you have a couple websites. Do you want to share any of the websites where people can go and maybe read a little bit more about this?
Yeah, we have many. We have colonialcemetery.com, which is the cemetery that we're updating. We're digitizing all of the markers that exist in Gods of the Laker and the stories behind that. We have a website called sablesoldiers.com in recognition and commemoration of African-American men and women during World War I, and particularly here within Newport. In fact, Arthur Burton Post recognizes Arthur Burton, a Rhode Island resident of color who was killed during World War I. So we have a number of websites and social learning programs. We'll be doing some programs across the state in the next several months, really starting to tout this diverse history. And I think our goal is, Ryan, is to create a diversity of history learning experiences. I think people are very bogged down on one and two elements of Black history when our history is as diverse as we are as a people.
When do you think the educational program will roll out?
It's a deliberate process, Frank. I mean, we started several years ago, and that began with the process of documentation and validation. And then from there, we began a process of collecting and organizing these resources and what could become units of instruction. In fact, as I said earlier, several years ago, a team of us had provided to the Rhode Island Department of Education a web link that provides resources to African-American history over a 4-century period. And any teacher or any student or any interested party or parent could go into that website and have access to lots of information. We are now also looking at developing a process for professional development because it's absolutely essential that our teachers have access to professional training and development and assistance so they can do their job and teach our children this access to African-American history and education. And let me say one qualifier, because I've had some folks will from time to time say, well, why African-American history? Why not just American history? Why so exclusive? Well, first of all, African-American history is taught as a part of American history. As I'd said earlier, African heritage people have been in this state at its very founding. They've contributed to every aspect of our social, cultural, religious, and economic well-being. So by learning more about African-American men, women, and families, you learn more about your community, your state, and your country. So we're very excited about this. I think you'll hear some great announcements later this year towards this effort. But I think what's most important is it has to be done in a very deliberate, very documented, in a very comprehensive fashion. And then ultimately, once it's made available, I think it would be exciting to make it available to all K-12 schools across the state.
We've been on for a while. Is there anything that you think is important, a message you'd like to leave people with on this Martin Luther King Day?
Well, again, I think what's most important is that rather than just posting a quote from Martin Luther King, learn about the man, the time that he lived. I mean, everything that made Martin Luther King was the Black church, and he was fighting for Black civil rights. And I'd have to say that today, for any of us and all of us that enjoy basic civil rights in this country, we stand on the shoulders of Martin Luther King. We stand on the shoulders of particularly African Americans who fought for this and continue to fight for social and equal justice in the entire evolution of this country.
Keith, go ahead, Ryan.
Keith, we've been having a lot of authors on, and just because we've been talking a lot about our books, wondering if you have any books you recommend for people to pick up. And, for those who want to continue their education at any age, or just looking for a good book, do you have any favorite books that you'd recommend people pick up?
All that I can tell you is that for the Providence Project, we are assembling a bibliography, and it's already past 400 sources. So,
Okay.
Keith,
and primary sources, secondary sources, because again, we're talking about 4 centuries of history. So it would be unfair for me to say, read this particular book because you have a particular interest in the colonial maritime history, when we could be talking about, obviously, the turn of the 20th century, or in the areas. Actually, I will tell you one area that needs to be looked at carefully in Newport's history, in the areas of social justice, and it's not the slave trade. It's the mid-20th century in urban redevelopment. It's the advent of the building of America's Cup Boulevard, Memorial Boulevard, and the deconstruction of a number of historic neighborhoods that were largely limited, working poor, and people of color. And there's a significant amount of primary data and research about that time. And I think it's one thing that would surprise Newporters if they read very carefully and understood the evolution of Newport, not during the 18th century, but the evolution and changes of Newport in the mid-20th century that brings us to this very day today. It certainly shaped our waterfront, it shaped our tourism economy, and it shaped the population that we currently have to this day, including how public housing was designed and developed and who it was designed and developed for.
Excellent.
Thank you very much. It's an important conversation to have any day, maybe particularly on this day.
Yeah, and again, when I can, I'll certainly send you guys that bibliography when I get released to. But it's pretty extensive, and it's north of 400 sources already. So we're very excited about it.
Read every single book, and then you can tell me about them.
Will do. All right, Keith. Well, I appreciate you joining, and we'll see you around town.
Great, thank you, and happy Martin Luther King holiday.
That's to you as well.
All right, that is Keith Stokes and Frank Prosnitz. Great chat, getting some good feedback, and I appreciate you lining that up.
Well, Keith is a very special individual, and I think a tremendous resource in a lot of different areas. And it's always great to have him on. It's always great when he corrects me, and that's okay. I learn a lot from him. He's a very special individual.
All right, my friends. Well, we will talk to you a little bit later this week. We'll be continuing our conversations with authors as well as politicians and more as the week continues.
Very good. Thank you.
All right. On behalf of Frank Prosnitz and myself, as well as all of us here at What's Up New, I want to thank Keith Stokes for joining us today. If you missed any portion of this conversation, you can go back and watch it anytime after I hit this end broadcast button on our Facebook page or on our website for the very latest on what's happening new in Newport County, across Rhode Island. Visit whatsupnuke.com. Thanks for watching.